Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome, brothers and sisters, ladies and gentlemen, to lecture 3 of Nihilism as a Poison. We've been going through this series, so we're just making our way through it. If you haven't seen the previous 2 lectures, don't worry, you can still watch this one. The other 2 will be put on to both the website at sapiensinstitute.org and also on the Sapience Institute YouTube channel. So do make sure to check those out, inshallah. So first of all, for those of you new here, I won't kill this out because I've done this at the beginning of each of the lectures, but who am I? So my name is Yusuf Ponders. I have a YouTube channel, Pondering Soul. Feel free to check the content out that I have over there, and a website, ponderingsoul.blog. You can also find me on social media, Twitter, Facebook, at Yusuf Ponders. My background, I've got a BA in philosophy. My focus was specifically in things like nihilism, ethics, metaphysics, things like that, and philosophy of religion. My dissertation was on nihilism, and I did a series with Sabor Ahmed from Darwinian Delusions, also working with Sapience Institute and IERA. You can find that playlist on my YouTube channel. And that basically goes through the dissertation, which was further reading for this lecture series, which explores the idea of the meaning of life, or the negation of it, from a different angle to what we've been going through specifically in these lectures, and with the associated essay that I have written specifically for the Sapience Institute, which you can find on their website as well. And inshallah, we're going to be, I plan on continuing my masters in philosophy, and kind of want to continue my education down this particular route concerning nihilism, ethics, and such. So just to kind of recap, now just as when you're traveling, it's good to kind of check out your local area and see what's immediately in front of you. But it's also good to have a look at the map, to zoom out a little bit and to see where you've come from, where you're going to, and look at the journey as a whole. And so we'll do that at the beginning here. So lecture 1, we went over the concepts, just to recap and instill that in the people's minds that already did this, and to sort of give a bit of an insight to those who haven't yet done this. In lecture 1, we asked the question, what is nihilism exactly? And we do this by exploring the concept itself, and that which presupposes it. So we have a look at the meaning of meaning, and we try to kind of wrap our heads around what it means to do that. We look at the ideas of meaning being something presupposed in asking that question. So you already seem to have an understanding in order to be able to ask it. And then we seem to have some sort of precognitive understanding of meaning. We seem ready loaded to deal with the world in a meaningful way. And this seems to be an innate part of our being, and much more so to an extreme extent in the human being than in the general animal that you see in the animal kingdom. Like it is with many things you see with the human being, we take things above and beyond what other animals are capable of. And so from there, we move on to asking, well, what does meaning mean in relation to life? Therefore asking, what is the meaning of life, and what do we mean when we ask this question? And then we had a look at, well, what do we mean now by nihilism, or the negation of the meaning of life, to deny that life has any meaning or purpose. And so after exploring that, we then went on to lecture 2, having a look at the environmental conditions, or the sociological conditions that may give rise to the phenomena, which is nihilism. And we did that in 2 parts. First part was looking at Nietzsche's kind of approach to this, with reference to higher values undermining themselves, and with pessimism as being the prototype for nihilism. And this sort of underpins this idea of nihilism as a sickness, or nihilism as a poison, which is the theme of these particular lectures. And we explored that the pessimism itself is sort of what underpins the approach of nihilism, and is sort of like a foundational gateway, as it were, to the onset of the experience of nihilism. And in this exploration, we hone in on the idea that pessimism is a state of being, one of many states of beings, but that it colours a affects the world in which you look at prior to your evaluation. And obviously, if you're suffering from pessimism and begin to evaluate the world while suffering from it, that it can lead to these nihilistic outlooks. And ultimately, it's kind of underpinned by this sort of hopelessness, this having a bad opinion of the world and of a lack of hope in general. And then after that, we looked at a particular book, which was The Realms of Meaning, by a particular author, Mr. Phillips, I think his name was, Mr. Phoenix, Philip Phoenix. I may have gotten that a little bit wrong, but from what I remember, that's his name. And the book was called Realms of Meaning. And in this book, it's specifically a philosophy of education book, but it focuses on the idea of meaning being integral to the education of the human being and fundamentally important. And in that, he explores also threats to meaning. And there were 4 specific threats we looked at. The first one, I can't remember them in order, but there was the overabundance problem. So there being too many things, or too much information, too much going on, and the human being being unable to process it. There was industrialization and alienation, so kind of the onset of this sort of hedonistic / capitalistic and materialistic worldview that sort of dominates modern culture, and the problems that come along with that in isolating and as it says in the title, alienating the human being. We also looked at, can't remember the other 2. Let me get the book. Bear with me. Yeah, so the first one, was the spirit of criticism and skepticism, and how this underpins much of the scientific endeavor and very much in the realm of philosophy as well. And obviously, not to bastardize that approach to the world completely, because obviously it has its benefits, even from an Islamic perspective. We should be critical of the information we're being given about the religion. There's much false information being spread by those who wish to destroy Islam or those who are against it, and even from within, from those who sort of deviate from the Sunnah and the Quran, and they wish to sort of input or implement their own sort of quote unquote innovations, or not quote unquote, they are in many cases innovations. And so, you need to be careful when approaching these things and be somewhat skeptical, verify your sources, look into it, think about what you're being presented, and go through it patiently. But it can have its negative effects as well when it expresses itself in the form of a severe skepticism that can never be let go of, to the point where it just can, everything can be questioned ad infinitum, to the point where you end up having to, although many don't when they suffer from this, but having to even question the skepticism itself. But this underlies many of the problems that sort of give rise to nihilism. And then finally, the last one was rates of change. So we were looking at how the speedy sort of changes that take place in modern society, how back in the day maybe someone could live in the same world that their great grandfather lived in without there having been much change. That isn't even the case for one generation, that the same person today can be born in one decade and then every decade experience a complete revolution or transformation of the society that they live in, to the point where in the end, the final sort of decade that they are alive in, it bears no resemblance to the first decade in which they grew. And this gives rise to a lack of a sense of security, of impermanence, and all of these 4 particular threats to meaning are ripe grounds for the increase in the feeling of nihilism, both individually and as a society. And today, we're going to look, rather than at what the cause is, that is what leads to nihilism, we're going to be looking at the sort of what follows from nihilism. What are the consequences from nihilism? And then next week, in the last lecture, lecture 4, we'll be looking at Islam as a potential antidote to nihilism and how to approach the issues that we've been outlining in the first 3 lectures, and how Islam can offer itself as a resolution to the problems that are raised here. So today we're going to focus specifically on what are the consequences of nihilism, with an aim at 4 particular categories. That is the 4 methods in which, the 4 areas in which we can consider things in terms of nihilism. So there's epistemological nihilism, which is to do with our study of knowledge; moral nihilism, which is to do with ethics and morality; cosmic nihilism, which is, as it suggests, is to do with the cosmos; and existential nihilism, which is to do with the experience of an individual going through nihilism, or the nihilism of existence. And so yeah, they're set out in terms of in 2 ways. So we've got the sort of reasoned justifications, but these are very loose reasonings. Keep in mind, this is the sort of thinking that the average person may go through when looking into this on the internet or on YouTube, not necessarily what the academic is reading and writing about, although there will be mention of the academic work on this as well, briefly here and there. But it's kind of just to show what the typical person, when they start suffering from nihilism, the kind of conclusions they may come to, and the simple sort of reasoning that they use to kind of get there. I will highlight certain problems with this reasoning as we go through, but it's by no means extensive nor exhaustive in terms of the explanations, and by no means does it mean to be. We've only got a limited amount of time in these essays. Everything can always be sort of extended into a series on its own. So we will be running through these rather briefly, so to speak, compared to what can be said on the matter. And so we're going to look at this sort of simple reasoning, but also on the consequences in terms of the sickness, that is the sort of knee-jerk reaction to the experience of nihilism, so to speak. Now, all of this does contain within it its own presuppositions and axioms. These are inescapable, and obviously we'll relate them also to this sort of societal exhaustion and pessimism. But inshallah, it should give you an insight into what someone who's sort of inclining toward nihilism might be thinking. But again, it's simple reasoning. Countless back and forth can be had on this particular conversation. It's also expressive of the problem itself, the fact that these back and forth can go on ad infinitum. Relates to this issue of overabundance of information, and can ironically give rise to the feeling of nihilism as well. Knowledge independent of God and its problems. So it will give rise to this. These are all points to consider while we're going through this, by the way. So the idea of attaining knowledge that isn't revealed. So when engaging with the world and trying to figure things out about it, the difficulty of this, especially with the absence of God and the human being trying to do it independently from that. We're also going to be looking at nihilism as a form of madness as we go through this, that embraces chaos, which is to say that it's by no means does the appearance of a contradiction necessarily deter the nihilist from being a nihilist. You know, and we'll go through this, and it should, inshallah, become a bit more obvious why towards the end of it, or part way through it. But yeah, so the nihilist itself is chaos. There's no duty to anything, be that reason, logic, and things like that. It arises out of this this sort of the higher values turning their sting upon themselves, and even the tools which may even give rise to nihilism themselves becoming undermined by the processes in which they are being used. But again, this will become more clear, but just keep these kind of things. And again, this is by no means an exhaustive account. So we shall begin, inshallah, with part 1, which is epistemological nihilism. Let me just check the everything, just to be sure. Can you all hear me? And just so you know, the recordings, they will be released on the YouTube. So just keep an eye on the YouTube channel which is the Sapience Institute YouTube channel, and also on the Sapience Institute website. They're not, as far as I'm aware, they've not been published yet, but they will be. So do not worry, and obviously feel free to continue watching this one, as I think you'd still find it insightful, even if you haven't watched the first 2 lectures, inshallah. So, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. I'm just going to assume you can all hear me because no one's saying that you can't. Epistemological nihilism. So first of all, what is epistemology? So epistemology is the theory of knowledge, or the study of knowledge, especially with regard to its methods, its validity, and its scope, and the distinction between justified belief and opinion. So it's really just the academic study of how we know what we know. What is knowledge exactly? How do we attain it? How can we confirm that something is knowledge? That is, that something is known and not merely just, as it says here, opinion. What is a justified belief? And so how does this relate to nihilism? So epistemological nihilism is a severe form of skepticism, which can go as far as denying the existence of truth altogether. And obviously, you can see here there would be a necessary consequence insofar as you deny truth, as you would also be denying here our ability to gain any true knowledge. That is, if you can't get hold of truth, how can you know anything about the world? So the question here is, why be severely skeptical? What kind of things might give rise to this? So first of all, there's issues with evolutionary reliabilism. So obviously in the mainstream, it is taught that we evolved from lesser beings. And this isn't specifically an Islamic position. We believe Adam alayhi salam was created independently. He was a miraculous creation. Whether or not other things evolved, we're happy to leave that to the scientific community. But insofar as they make mention of Adam alayhi salam being a myth, we just say simply, if we believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and he was capable of creating the universe as it was, as beautiful and as intrinsic and as complex as it is, then is it not possible for him to have been able to create a independent being and placed it within that creation, regardless of whether or not everything else had experienced an evolutionary process, be that from a common ancestor or multiple beginning points or multiple ancestors? All of this is, fair game for the scientific community, but from this study, they cannot completely write off the possibility that Adam alayhi salam was a miraculous creation. But this we will go into it in a little more detail as well when it comes to understanding how science sort of approaches things, when we make mention of Thomas Kuhn and paradigm shifts and things like that. But for the time being, we're just going to focus on the consequences of this type of thinking and how this can lead to a sort of epistemological nihilism. So certain questions arise with this idea. Evolutionary reliabilism is an understanding of our cognitive faculties being reliable as a consequence of a particular understanding of the evolutionary process. So the question is does evolution give rise to the likelihood that a species will continue to exist if it favors truth, or if it is more capable of attaining a true picture of its environment or of the world in which it again engages with? That is, are our cognitive faculties capable of achieving truth, and is this truth reliably known? Now, there's a double-edged sword sort of issue here. So the first one is with reference to the jewel beetle. So the jewel beetle is a beetle in Australia that nearly went extinct because of an embarrassing little mistake that it made. So the Australians really like their beer, and they liked, well, at least they did, they liked the beer in brown shiny bottles. And they would often litter these on the floor And unfortunately for the jewel beetle, it had evolved in such a way, not necessarily to achieve true truth about the world, not necessarily to achieve a complete picture about the world that it was living in, but it kept sort of it evolved with certain traits and shortcuts that would help it. And this, unfortunately, when it came to the Australians throwing their bibbles on the floor, led to a disadvantage, and that was that the jewel beetle confused the shiny brown bottles to be potential mates, and what they ended up doing is basically mating with these glass bottles to the point of death, and they weren't reproducing. And it's a genuine problem that was recognized by the scientific community with the jewel beetle. But this itself was a good evidence to suggest that the evolutionary process doesn't necessarily favor truth, but rather that the process itself can give rise to faculties not that and not the products of truth seeking, but simply of survivability, of what is, here in this case with the jewel beetle, it involved to look for shiny brown objects in the desert in Australia. Obviously, when something came in the way of that, that whole world, that whole ecosystem nearly collapsed. And so you can see here that the system itself it didn't evolve to have an accurate picture of the world, because if it did, it would have been able to recognize the distinction between a jewel beetle and a glass bottle. But they weren't able to do that. Now, if the case is that the evolutionary process does not give rise to cognitive faculties which favor truth or are capable of recognizing truth, then what does this say about the human being? And obviously, if that is the case, how can we even trust our own cognitive faculties in our exploration of the world? How do we know when we're engaging in the scientific method if the evolutionary process does not favor truth, but rather just simply survivability? How can we know that anything we think is true about the world is? So this is one part of the quote unquote the double-edged sword problem. And the other issue is, well, say, for example, we disregard this and we say that no, truth does favor survivability, or that having cognitive faculties which are capable of attaining true information about the world are going to give rise to more likely to give rise to the species being more likely to survive. You have another big issue here. The most successful species on the planet has been across the board religious. Richard Dawkins himself has been documented saying on the Joe Rogan podcast that there hasn't been an atheist society. And so the question is, well, why? If the evolutionary process is something which favors truth, then does that not in some way suggest that there is a severe amount of truth to be found in the religious mindset? Now, obviously, there's varying opinions on the different religions in terms of what it means to be religious, but they do follow a common theme. They do understand that there is a sort of a supernatural entity that is transcendent in nature that created everything, or entities in some cases. They believe in this mind-body dualism. They believe in the existence of a soul, in life after death. They believe in many things in common. And if you believe that the evolutionary process gives rise to sort of this truth-bearing faculties, then why is it that the most common species on the planet has this in common? And why is it that it seems to be, or you seem to be able to make the correlation between this and it's being hyper successful in relation to every other species you see on the planet? There's no species like the human being that can completely transform its environment the way we do. So this is an issue. Evolutionary reliabilism. Does evolution give rise to reliable cognitive faculties? Yes or no? Either way, you have these problems. But the case is that those who are pessimistic, those who have a low opinion of the world, or of low expectations, and consider the worst of everything. As we mentioned in the second lecture, we're talking about nihilism being characteristic of a state of being. That is, the person is feeling pessimistic. They're not likely to have a high opinion or have hope that the world is going to have this sort of fundamental beginning with a creator that's all powerful, etc. And so there's going to be certain things being written off here. They're not necessarily going to be looking at the fact that the most successful species is religious. They may just simply be willing to say, yeah, well, it's not true, and evolutionary faculties do not give rise to truth-bearing cognitive faculties, but rather they do favor falseness or falsehood. And so the human being a prime example of that, something that is majorly inclined to falsehood, and therefore has been able to be majorly successful because of that. This is characteristic of a particular state of mind, but obviously this stings itself in that if that is the case, how then can the one making these decisions, the one making these observations, how can they trust the path in which they've taken if this path itself relies on those faculties in which they are now criticizing? But as we said earlier as well, the nihilist isn't necessarily going to be committed to reason or to logic at all. And this is based on this, again, idea of the higher values turning their sting upon themselves, or in other words, undermining themselves. And reason and logic are among those values. So why does the epistemological nihilist not necessarily have to stick to logic or reason? Obviously they're already suffering from nihilism at this point, and it just becomes a case of sort of explaining or reinforcing that pessimism. It's a nasty feedback loop in shorter terms. And so you get to this point where it's like, well, how do we justify reason? We've made reason a higher value, and we've made logic and reason a higher value. But if again we've been these creatures that have evolved, then does that not mean that these faculties evolved with us? And there's a really good quote by the German philosopher Edmund Husserl. He wrote this in his book, The Idea of Phenomenology, translated by Lee Hardy. The references at the bottom there, so if you want to check it out, you're welcome to. I think you can get a PDF of this book. Really good book. It's one of my favorite ones, and it's like an introduction into phenomenology. This man was sort of the father of the philosophy of phenomenology, and this led to many of the existentialist thinkers. So he was Martin Heidegger's teacher. Martin Heidegger ended up taking over his position in the German university that he was leading in or teaching in. And this eventually had a huge effect on other existentialist thinkers such as Albert Camus, Sartre, Simone de Beauvoir, and the likes of them. And so he was a very central figure, although he's really unknown in relation to the people that he influenced. But on this particular issue, that is on the idea of reason turning its sting upon itself, he says the following. So he says, but what is the use of appealing to contradictions if logic itself is in question and becomes problematic? Indeed, the real meaning of logical lawfulness, which natural thought would not dream of questioning, now becomes questionable and even dubious. Biological lines of thought now crowd in upon us. We are reminded of the modern theory of evolution, according to which man has developed through the struggle for existence and the process of natural selection. And with him, of course, also his intellect. This is key here. It's not just the man that evolved, according to this theory, but his intellect also. His mind developed and changed as time went through. With him, of course, also his intellect. And with the intellect, the forms that belong to it, especially the logical forms. Do not logical forms and logical laws, then, simply express the contingent peculiarities of the human species? But couldn't they have been different And won't they become different in the course of future evolution? Knowledge then is just human knowledge, bound to the forms of the human intellect, incapable of making contact with the very nature of things, with the things themselves. Now, he was very influenced by Immanuel Kant with regards to the quote unquote the things in themselves. And it's a very interesting quote because it does really highlight a huge problem. What is logic and reason? What do we understand by these things? Now, from this sort of materialistic presupposition, this materialist reductive position, or reductive materialism, and if you're kind of just looking at the world as fundamentally just being sort of lifeless and literally just material atoms or energy, quantum fluctuations, whatever you want to call it, you're not saying that the fundamental underpinning of this is consciousness. It's just dead matter bouncing off each other like pool balls. Then how are we to understand this idea or this concept of logic or this concept of reason? Is it not something that developed with life? Is it not intrinsically connected to consciousness? And as consciousness developed, did these logical laws not develop with it? Are they not simply descriptions of how we see the world, or are they independent? And if they are independent, what does it mean to say they are independent in a world that is fundamentally underpinned by a lack of consciousness? How do we come to understand these laws? And this becomes a huge predicament because we're not, as Edmund Husserl here, are they not just human peculiarities? Can they not become different? And if logic evolved with the being and developed to what it is today, what we consider logical, is that not different from the past? Many principles are becoming undermined. You've got the rise of things like postmodernism, which seek to undermine these quote unquote Eurocentric ideas that developed in the West of what logic is. They seek to undermine the logical principles, and this was a philosophy, funnily enough, that also developed in Europe. Many of the postmodern philosophers that began to question logic and reason and things like that came out of France, with the likes of, I can't remember the names exactly, but the French philosophers, the more famous ones, Michel Foucault, Derrida, these types. And they were very much behind this sort of movement called the postmodernist movement, which starts to question all of these Western assumptions, this European Enlightenment enthusiasm with the ability of the human being. But it was the same enthusiasm that ended up, ironically, undermining itself, which is a common feature of philosophy. And so, yeah, we've got these problems with this reductive materialism. We've got these problems of consciousness. How do we go from this quantum world to life? How do we get from this dead matter, these atoms, these quarks, or whatever these are, to the conscious being which looks upon the universe and tries to understand it, that has the experience of qualia, it has a subjective experience? How do we jump this gap? How do we go from there to here? And it's very common when you hear the physicists or the biologists talking about all of this. When it comes to trying to explain life, there's TED Talks and science festival conversations that take place on YouTube, and they whenever it gets to the point of, well, how do we describe life, they funnily enough start referring to words like, oh, it's like magic to us. They obviously don't mean literally magic, but it's a mystery to them. It's a huge mystery. Consciousness itself is a massive problem, and they're not quite sure how to jump these gaps. And this is itself something that motivates this epistemological nihilism, this doubting that we have an ability to achieve knowledge, this hyper-skepticism. And this is also a consequence of our daunting finitude. And again, The fact that we can just keep asking questions, we can keep applying skepticism with no end ad infinitum. We can keep asking, what if? What if this? What if that? What if the universe was created 5 minutes ago, 10 minutes ago, 20 minutes ago? Are all of these possible? Is everything equally possible? You can keep asking these questions. And how can we be sure we have any real knowledge? Problems have been, these problems in particular have been very interesting for both theists and atheists alike. We have tried to develop our own epistemologies, and there are a number of them. The field of epistemology is a very in-depth one that someone, if they wish to, could dedicate their life to studying and still probably not get through all of the literature or come to a comprehensive understanding. Epistemology is a very interesting field of study, and there's a lot of debate going on here, and it doesn't seem to be getting settled, but it only seems in secular academia to be getting more and more complex. The differences seem to be increasing rather than decreasing. Yeah, and so with reference to the thing in itself, this is a Kantian concept, and Nietzsche was also fond of talking about this. And in his essay on Truth and Lying in a Non-Moral Sense, which you can find in a few books that contain a collection of his essays, he says the following. So he says, the thing in itself, which would be precisely pure truth, truth without consequences, is impossible for even the creator of language to grasp. And indeed, this is not at all desirable. He designates only the relations of things to human beings, and in order to express them, he avails himself of the boldest metaphors. So for him, language is, he's only going to refer to it as metaphors. But not only that, the whole development is a jumping from one metaphor to another, as you'll see here. So he says, the stimulation of a nerve is first translated into an image, first metaphor. The image is then imitated by a sound, second metaphor. And each time there is a complete leap from one sphere into the heart of another, new sphere. So here, if we look at that transformation from the first metaphor to the second metaphor, when he's talking about language, we see something, we see this cup, and when we see it, this the light hits it, bounces into our eyes, and we produce an image or a concept, an idea of what it is to be a cup, and then we associate a noise to it, and this noise we then throw around. And so I'll shout it out, I'll say cup, and you'll hear it, and your brain has got its own little idea of what a cup is, and it will present this idea to you. And this is what he's saying. He's saying that there's this transformation from one sphere to another, and this is shown. So he's got a good example here to kind of explain this. He says, one can conceive of a profoundly deaf human being who has never experienced sound or music. Just as such a person will gaze in astonishment at the Chandelian sound figures in sand, find their cause in the vibration of a string. So these Chandelian sound figures, you've probably seen it where there's like a plate put on top of speakers or on top of a subwoofer, and then there's sand put on it, and then noises are played and patterns appear on the sheet or on the plate. And so he's saying here that someone might be looking at these images appear on top of the plate with the sand and the bass, etc. And then he might find some string, because obviously I don't think in Nietzsche's time they had subwoofers. But you might find some string vibrating and swear that he now must know what men call sound. This is precisely what happens to all of us with language, that we're communicating these concepts and these ideas with these noises, and we feel as though that these noises are communicating or transferring information completely, but they're not. They're going through these incredible transformations. That is, he's referring to them as metaphors, and this problem goes deeper than language, and this is something that Kant points to with this idea of the thing in itself. So you have the sun. The sun gives off its light rays, which hit objects, and these objects reflect certain light. So you have information that is light traveling in the form of waves from the sun. When it hits the object, a number of these light waves are absorbed and a few of them are let go. This determines the color. And so with a yellow rubber ducky, for example, or with a yellow duckling, the only color that's released here, all the colors are being absorbed by the duck, but what is being released is the yellow light waves, or the light waves that are of a particular frequency that when they are picked up by the eye, we experience them as yellow. And so this information hits the duck, bounces off it, hits our eye, which then runs through nerves. So you have transformations here, these radical transformations. You have light bouncing off, pure light, white light from the sun bouncing off a duck. The duck steals, quote unquote, steals some of that light and lets some of it go. And this information off the object that it's hit is being carried through the air now that it's hit the object. The eye picks that up and transforms the light into electrical signals that run through nerves. So you have a complete transformation when it hits the duck. You have another transformation when it hits the eye. So it goes from being just light waves to being electrical signals which follow through the nerves. Then, once it goes through the nerves, the mind processes it. What does that mean exactly? Allahu Alam. It's the mind is picking up this information that it's being fed from the eyes, and it processes it. Do you have any say in that process? Do you have any idea how that process takes place? What mechanisms are like running? You know, how certain things are neglected in that data and discarded, because there's a lot of information coming through these eyes. There's a lot of things going on in the vision, and even psychologists themselves will say that the brain is actively removing most of that information because it would just be too overwhelming for the subject if it didn't. But the brain is doing this. The brain is going through the process of processing this information, and then it presents to the subject, it presents to the consciousness an image. And this consciousness assumes that what is being presented to it is identical to the thing in itself. That is, the experience of the thing is an accurate representation of the thing in itself. Now, the problem is how do we identify that that is true? If every piece of information that we ever receive is constantly being processed and played about with before it's presented to us, and we can't get in the way of that, we have no way of knowing for sure whether or not the objects of our experience resemble the things in themselves. And this is a problem that Kant highlighted. And it's a very interesting problem. And it makes you think, well, does it? Like, what is the world really like? And is science really giving me a genuine picture of the world? Even the picture of the atom. This is art. I wrote an article on this, Science as Art. Science uses metaphor constantly to teach us things. It's very pragmatic. And this isn't to say that you should stop valuing science. There's a lot of valuable things that come from it. But it is to say that you should understand the process in which science develops. You understand science is what I'm telling you to do. Not just take it as a given that it gives you truths as though they are biblical truths, which is quite funny considering the subject matter. So this is a problem for the empiricist. It's a problem for the empiricist because it cannot get in the way of the mind processing the information, and it has no way of verifying the two. It has no way of sitting the qualia, or the object of experience, beside the object that gave rise to the experience, and seeing to what degree these actually correlate, or to what degree these things match what has been lost in that transfer of information, in that transformation of information. So what can we say we know about the world when we have to suffer from these issues in any absolute sense? This can be quite overwhelming, and this touches on the cause again that we mentioned in lecture 2, that being overwhelmed by overabundance, an overabundance of information, an overabundance of problems. How do we deal with this? The notion of truth begins to feel undermined here for the person going through this process of pessimism. They have a very low opinion of the world and of their abilities to sort of seek and gain knowledge. And this is a consequence of the fact that truth and knowledge themselves are intimately connected. Now, if the notion of truth is being lost, let's have a look here, 1 second. Yeah, so again, this is underpinned by these ideas of pessimism, etc. And truth and knowledge are intimately connected, so as I mentioned before. And when it comes to things like truth as a moral value, so we see here, Nietzsche says in The Will to Power, and this is a quote I've brought up a number of times, but it's very relevant. The logic of pessimism leads ultimately to nihilism, but what motivates it? The notion that everything is worthless, meaningless, the way that moral judgments lie behind all other high ideals. Now, this is very much going to touch on the following section when we move on to moral nihilism. But it's this idea that truth itself is a moral judgment. And once you get to a point where you've undermined truth, you undermine your ability to achieve knowledge, you undermine a lot of things, and it sort of just tumbles from there. And especially when you keep in mind you've undermined, like we mentioned, even the idea of reason, of rationality, of logic, through this sort of looking glass, through this way of seeing the world. Now, there's a very interesting book that talks about the scientific process, and it's written by an author called Thomas Kuhn, and the book is called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And in this book, which I highly recommend, he talks about these shifting paradigms, or how science goes through transformations in terms of its understanding of the world, in terms of the paradigm that it looks upon the world through. And he describes this as moving through 2 phases. First phase being normal science, moving into a phase of extraordinary science. Now, normal science is sort of seen as the typical view that everyone sort of understands of science. You see science as this conglomerate of geniuses collecting facts, data, and information about the world and developing theories. And the major contributions, the geniuses, the Einsteins, the Newtons, that give data, just seems to be adding to this pile of facts that we're collecting, this absolute knowledge. And this is the general view that I think many people have of the world. It's just this idea of collecting data, information, and developing theories. And then they have their instruments, which they use to collect more and more data, more accurately, more finely, in more detail. And as these instruments improve, as these instruments themselves develop and are fine-tuned, this gives rise to problems. These problems arise in the form of gaps in our knowledge, in the forms of anomalies. And all of these problems, anomalies and gaps themselves motivate the undermining of the initial paradigm. That is, they see the world in a particular way, filled with particular assumptions, and when certain problems arise, they first begin to view them through particular assumptions, through certain axioms and presuppositions, in order to try to overcome the problem. Now, in many cases, the problem does become overcome through this method, but sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes looking at the world through those initial presuppositions, through those initial axioms, doesn't fix anything. In fact, it only causes more problems. And so Kuhn, he says, this motivates a period of creativity or of chaos. It's like the Wild West in trying to understand the anomalies, leading to revolutions. And this is what opens up the transition from the first paradigm, that is normal, quote unquote, normal science, to extraordinary science or revolutionary science. where the people involved do become a lot more creative. The process becomes a lot more random. They have to mix things up, maybe try different assumptions. And this is where science becomes a lot more philosophical. It has to start to look into the philosophy of science. What are the assumptions we've been making here? What is the metaphysics that have been used that have led us to these anomalies in the first place? Which particular assumptions are up for doubt now? Because we can't deal with this. And you see this happen. There's two famous cases of this. Is the issue of phlogiston. Phlogiston, or the phlogiston theory, is one that it's a superseded scientific theory that postulated the existence of a fire-like element, which they named phlogiston, hence the phlogiston theory. And it was contained within combustible bodies and released during combustion. And this was an accepted theory for a while. And the scientists, you could catch them, but these were the geniuses of the time, the top dogs, and you would catch them talking to each other and discussing phlogiston. And had you been a layman observing these conversations, you might come to think, oh, these guys, mashallah, they're very clever, aren't they? Look at all these things they know. And if you were to hear about it, you might even propagate it and talk, oh, the scientists recently are talking about this new thing they've discovered, phlogiston. But then, as we kind of go through this period that I've been mentioning to you, so you've got normal science, the anomalies started to arise, and more anomalies began to arise. And this forced them to have to completely relook it. And this led eventually to the discovery of oxygen, which ultimately undermined a very particular paradigm where people looked at the world in terms of a minimal number of elements. And it opened up the possibility that maybe there was many elements, and eventually you get the development of the periodic table and the scientific understanding we have now. But that was a shift from one paradigm to another. And it wasn't the only one. You had the Copernican revolution. That is, this idea that the Earth was the center of the universe, moving to this idea of the sun as the center of the solar system. And this helped scientists to explain the movement of the planets. But again, it was a paradigm shift. It held a number of assumptions, and a lot of these were given up. And this wild west period of extraordinary science had to really run its ground in order to allow that paradigm shift to occur. And you get the same thing when you have this movement from the Newtonian paradigm, so the Newtonian understanding of gravity, to Einstein's theory of general relativity. These are all these periods of transformation, of shifting paradigms, but it also really reveals how science operates. It operates under a number of assumptions. It is guided by the experimentary process. What it is that we are looking into guides the narrative, guides the principles that we're holding on to. And so what this shows is that science itself is it deals with the best working models until they are falsified. That isn't to say that they are false or that everything that we hold on to is going to be falsified, but that we can't genuinely know, or we can't make absolute knowledge claims with the scientific method. We can only make the appeal to the best explanation, and we hold on to the best explanation until it gets to a point where certain things are undermined. This touches on the notion of our understanding of Adam alayhi salam being a miraculous creation, for example. Science just cannot offer absolute truths. And so if you have very good reasons to accept the idea or the concept of there being one God, if you have very good reasons to accept the Islamic notion of revelation, of prophethood, etc., and to believe the truth of this, then the issue of Adam alayhi salam, the issue of evolution, ceases to be a problem. Again, we're not to say, it's not even to say that you have to deny evolution absolutely. If we all came from Adam, how else do you explain the different races? How do you explain the differences between the people of Nigeria and of China, or of the Native Americans, or of the Northern Europeans? There's clear distinctions between all of these groups of people. Yet if we all came from Adam alayhi salam, this must have been the process of some form of evolution. We just refuse to refer to Adam alayhi salam as a lesser being, or as a monkey, or as any of these kind of things. He was a human. He was capable of speech. We believe these because we derive these from our teachings, from the Quran and the Sunnah, and we come to believe these through particular reasoning. But back on to the subject matter. So epistemological nihilism, if you're suffering from this sort of pessimism, you're looking at the world through a sort of hopeless lens, and nihilism, it has arrived. All these causes that we mentioned in lecture 2 are acting upon you, and you're reading about this, and subhanAllah, you're getting to a point where it's like, how then, if science can't even offer me truth? You've got this hope, I guess. Maybe it was fueled by this naive optimism to begin with, that I wanted to achieve absolute knowledge. I wanted to achieve truth. It's sort of like a mistaken desire to have the knowledge of God himself, to know the world fully, to have this complete picture with no bit missing. And then the thing that modern society values the most, even that doesn't seem to be offering what it seemed to have been offering when it was being taught to me in primary school or in high school. But maybe I was a little too naive when approaching this idea of science and it being this sort of quote-unquote ultimate truth. Maybe there's a few problems. And again, this sort of there needs to be a distinction here between academic approaches to these subjects and the approach that the average person or the layman may take when coming across these. So the academic has plenty of time to read the literature, plenty of time to sit in an armchair by a window or a campfire or what's it called? Not a campfire, the fireplace, and to ponder on these questions for hours and hours and hours on end. The average person does not have this luxury. The average person has a job, has family to feed, has friends, has commitments and things, a lot of things that require their attention. Then the job may not give them the opportunity to think too deeply about these subjects. And so they only get brief overviews of the ideas that I'm putting forward to you now, in the same way that we've gone over them, in very, very minimal detail. And so, when you've not really got the time to think on these things, it can, through a sense of impatience and I guess of rushing and of this naive optimism leading to this sort of pessimistic view, you might understand why they sort of fall into this epistemological nihilism. And a form of escapism here is sort of escape into this post-truth era, again, which we touched on in the previous lectures. This idea that everything is fake news apart from that which I already believe. The mission to attain truth itself just seems like too much effort. How am I ever really going to figure out what's going on? Whether or not there is a truth, I don't even know. And even if there was, I wouldn't be able to attain it. I just don't have the time. That kind of mentality. And so they give up on the idea of ever achieving truth at all. And so they just kind of end up falling on this post-truth. I'll just go for whatever I feel might be the truth. And I might just have conviction in that. And, this is a common word that's been thrown around more and more recently, this idea of post-truth. So that concludes the section on epistemological nihilism. And remember, keeping in mind that map view, that overview, you zoom out and try to understand where we're going with this. We're exploring the mindset or the consequences here of a nihilistic framework, of looking at the world in a nihilistic way. So when you're looking in terms of epistemology, how you can end up seeing the world in this way, where truth is something that is incredibly difficult to attain. We've gave the reason why. And you're looking at the world through the lens of reason and logic being the highest value, and having this naive view of what reason and logic are. You turn it upon itself, it stings itself. How do I justify it without recourse to either intuition or fallacious circle reasoning? Using reason and logic to lead you to these ideas of evolution, but then the whole process of evolution being something that undermines reason and logic. The development often something that can change, something that themselves can evolve. What do we do with this? How then do we know we can come to know anything? Even the process of how we attain experiences, we have these minds that are constantly fiddling with the information before it presents the world to us, and we can't get in the middle of that. It's very much like there's a wall of paint, and something or someone is on the other end firing tennis balls or golf balls through this wall of paint. Every time you get it, every time a ball gets to you, it's being coloured. It's being covered in some sort of paint. It's being transformed before you get it. And the only difference here is that it's like a permanent instant dry paint, and you can't get rid of that paint and see what the original thing was prior to that. It's being affected, it's being messed about with. The brain is processing this information and dealing with it. Even if you think about your experience of touch when you're engaging with the world, what is happening here is your brain, you've got some matter, you have atoms. I'll just go back here. So you have atoms which are touching other atoms, but they're not even touching. There's a gap between your fingers and the table, or the thing that you've put your hand upon. And what you feel as an object is really just the repelling of these atoms, which causes an electrical signal to run through these particular atoms. And you've just got this chain reaction of like signals running from atom to atom to atom to atom until it eventually reaches the nerves in your brain. And then your brain processes this information and gives you the experience of feeling like there is the experience of touch over in this direction, whatever that means. Like you're having the experience of a direction and of a sensation in this particular direction. And if you close your eyes, you get a sense of this mad experience of the position of your hands without even seeing them. And you move your hands up and down. Your brain is presenting this qualia to you of the position of your hands. But this is being presented to you. So even the position of your hands, never mind the external world, but the body itself is being presented to you as qualia, as an experience. And that process is a one of a presenting, is a one of the mind receiving information, fiddling with it, and then giving it to you. And that is very strange, especially when you look at it through a pessimistic, moral nihilist, or even atheistic lens. So now, moral nihilism. So what is moral nihilism exactly? So it is a claim that there are no moral facts, put bluntly. So when someone makes the claim that murder is wrong or murder is right, you have certain moral frameworks. Someone might say that killing is justified in certain context. The same or a different person with the same context might say that it's completely wrong. But to say that the act of killing is either right or wrong, moral or immoral, from the nihilistic perspective, is completely false. All moral claims, all ethical claims are false. They don't make any sense from a moral nihilistic perspective. And one of the reasons is it's a moral anti-realist position. So it doesn't believe that you can make genuine moral claims, or it doesn't believe there are moral facts in the world. And it takes another name, so it can also be known as error theory. And there are certain philosophers that put this particular theory forward, such as Richard Joyce, for example. He wrote a book called The Myth of Morality. And what he says about morality is he says that moral statements, he's a moral nihilist, he says moral statements fail to be true because they are vacuous. That is, he compares them to phlogiston. So I've already mentioned phlogiston in the mention of epistemological nihilism. And he says it's similar to this. It's felt as real by those embedded in the discussion with ignorance of its being wrong. So they've got very limited information. They've entered a particular paradigm. The same thing's going on here. You've got people talking about morality, talking about right and wrong, but ultimately he's saying that this is the consequence of an error, hence error theory. There is an error in the way of thinking here, an error in the understanding of what this particular thing is, and so ultimately these people are just sort of discussing these things without realizing that they've made this error. And he says there's a number of reasons why people dismiss or don't think this is true, or would reject his understanding of morality. And he says the main reason is that it's seen as dangerous. This notion that we've heard before: if God doesn't exist, everything is permissible. It's a quote attributed to Dostoevsky. And when it comes to discussions on moral nihilism, when it comes to discussions on moral nihilism, it's seen as dangerous. And so it's, if morality doesn't exist, then everything is permissible. And it's the same issues at hand here. People believe, and even the gentleman here, Richard Joyce, even he believes that morality is something precious and consequential, but he sees it as no less flawed despite that. And morality for him is a very pragmatic thing. And he says losing it has costs. But then he also says, and this is quite funny, because obviously if we keep in mind Nietzsche's statements that all values are underpinned by morality. And so he's putting forward a moral nihilist position. And he, funnily enough, he says, losing morality has its costs, but commitment to flawed discourse also has its cost. And he says the reason for this is because truth is valuable. Now, he seems to have completely missed that saying truth is valuable is a moral claim, that there is a value to truth, that truth is in and of itself a good that should be achieved or attained. Without morality, there doesn't seem to be any reason to value truth at all, because to say that it's valuable is in another way to say that it's good. And again, if he's already admitting that it is precious, morality is precious and consequential, and that losing it has costs, then how at this point can you still say that it's valuable or good? Like, even if you're looking at it the way he does, and losing, and he's happy to admit losing it has costs, what can possibly be achieved from getting rid of morality altogether under this notion, which he refers to as fictionalism? And so this is a method he puts forward. Just a kind of a little side note, quite interesting. Fictionalism is the view in philosophy that according to which statements that appear to be descriptions of the world should not be construed as such, but should instead be understood as cases of make-believe, of pretending to treat something as literally true while knowing and acknowledging that it isn't true. So in this sense, he wants to utilize morality like a storyteller, that is, to believe it's not true, to see utility in it, and to do this sort of win, cost, benefit, competition sort of thing. In a sense, he wants to look at morality in the same way that the average person looks at Santa, the Easter Bunny, the Tooth Fairy, as a myth that's commonly known as a myth, but something that value can be derived from. And he thinks that this step should be taken. Obviously, we can go into arguments about the consequences of taking this step, but it's, this is sort of telling of this general idea of moral nihilism. And I would say it's more the consequence of a particular kind of thinking. Again, he's not even noticed, for example, that the idea that truth is valuable is sort of underpinned by these notions of morality. And he was very much living in these issues that I pointed to in lecture 2. And so there is an argument to say these conditions themselves are what are giving rise to this theory, rather than his theory being a genuine sort of recognition of truth. But there's people even in academia suffering from this, and you will come across people in discussion, especially if you're on places like Twitter, or on the internet in general. You will come across moral nihilists. I've engaged with a few myself. Even pretty big YouTubers have claimed moral nihilist positions, which is incredibly funny considering a lot of their critiques are moral ones, for example, when it comes to criticizing Islam. But yeah, and so they want to just treat morality like this story, like telling a story. And it's got its value. It's got its, it's like the fables. And we can still derive some sort of value from them, but it's underpinned by this idea that we need to understand it or look at it through a particular paradigm, that is, that they are myths. So the question here is, well, the average person is not like Richard Joyce was his name. Yeah, Richard Joyce. So the average person is not the academic. And a disclaimer here: we're not making absolute claims about numbers. I'm not making a claim that X% of atheists are this or that. This isn't a course to tell you how to run up to an atheist, or how to run up to a quote unquote, well, not quote unquote, how to run up to other people who aren't Muslim or who are under any particular category and say, you're a moral nihilist. That's not what we're doing here today. If someone is, you can tell the telltale signs, because they're saying things which are reminiscent of the things we're talking about. And once you can identify that they hold on to these particular positions, it's at that point you can start saying, well, you are here a moral nihilist. The positions you're putting forward are moral nihilistic positions, or here you seem to be putting forward some sort of epistemological nihilism. This is a method in which you can, once you understand these categories and you understand these consequences, or these quote unquote these symptoms, you can start to identify what it is, and then from there we can move on and start to suggest a solution to that. So keep that in mind. At no point during these lectures am I making absolute claims, nor am I giving you statistics. I don't know how many people are affected by this. Allahu alam. I know that it is from personal experience, but this is anecdotal, and this should be kept in mind. That this kind of mentality can be a huge problem within council estates. From where I'm from Manchester, having kind of been all over the place here, and also having family and friends in other parts of the UK. So I have connections to Liverpool, to Glasgow, to London, to all over the UK pretty much. Especially when I was in uni, a lot of the students there were from all over the place, and you'd find them sort of reiterating similar views to this. And there's, especially within council estates, there's reason for that. There's a resentment for power that's quite common, and they don't really respect established authorities like the government, for example. Religion has become trivialized very much in the average council estate. People don't really take it too seriously. Even in the education system, it's a point of mockery. In popular culture, it's a point of mockery. The media that these young people are consuming is inundated with ideas of trivializing the concept of religion. The religious man is reduced to this mad person that stands on the corner screaming strange things. The end is nigh. It's very rare you see media as a young person. Like I say, this is anecdotal, and according to a lot of the conversations I've had with a lot of the general people that I used to spend a lot of time with, and sort of like observing the internet and things like that, you see these things cropping up. But yeah, and so these ideas of religion being trivialized, the reflective person looking at all of this while young and maybe impatient, not really having these particular virtues implemented in them, that is patience being like a major one of them. When they look at this, everything starts to seem arbitrary. It's like, why? And the more they ask why, these figures of authority are not necessarily giving them explanations. They're just telling them, because I've said so. Because I've said so. And this increases these conditions that we mentioned before, increases skepticism. And when people are not getting satisfying answers, or answers that satisfy them, not necessarily due to the fact that there aren't answers, half of the time as well, it's just simply because the people that are asking are not necessarily equipped to be able to give those answers, and they themselves asking those questions, they don't recognize their own limits, their own ignorance, and they have an inability to find the material on the subject matter. They don't necessarily know how to search academic material, and even if they could, how to engage with it, how to read it. You know, they can read, but there's a lot of complex terms going on in there. These books can be quite large and boring. There's no storyline in half of them. They don't even necessarily have the resources in order to buy the books or to get access to academic journals, and nor do they have the patience half of the time to go through all of these and read. So this generally, a lot of these problems, when it gets to the kind of the end of it, seems to be more of a consequence of this these issues. You know, that it can be tied more to societal problems than anything else. Yeah, so you know, and as Nietzsche says again, repeating his words, nihilism, there is no goal, no answer to the question why. Emphasis on that particular bit. And this is what people are feeling. They're aiming at things and they can't. Everything they aim at just seems to sort of dissolve, deteriorate. Every question they ask, why this, why that, they're not getting their answers, and so they end up in nihilism. And all of this itself is expressive of the spirit of criticism. It gets to a point of destructive skepticism, but it's unable to turn around and build anything. Not because, again, it's impossible, just because they're incapable of doing so. They've not been given the tools. You know, they've not got the equipment in order to resolve the problems at hand. Further consequences to this sort of moral nihilist position is that there is no necessary moral duty. People become apathetic. They become, you know, I don't really need to do this. It's not to say that people can't experience a sense of duty still in the world, even if they're atheists, or you know, even if they happen to hold other views similar to these categories that we're going through with regards to nihilism. But you know, there is no necessary moral duty. That is, that it's not binding. So although some people may experience it, others may not. And insofar as they're not experiencing this urgency or this need for moral duty, be that to the family, to the neighbor, to the friend, to the this, to that, you know, things again just seem arbitrary to them. So it's unjustified. In the sense that it's not been explained properly to them. Why should I? Why do I need to do this? Especially if they're growing or living in a world that's quite hostile. And the question that ends up just being raised here is, can I get away with it? If a person can get away with it, why not? If they have no sense of the divine, for example, and again, this is an argument for or against. In particular, it's just phenomenologically, if they just do not have an experience of the divine, they do not fear being watched by some sort of transcendent being, and if they look about and they can see that there is no one watching, and there is no, if they take it, there won't be any consequences to that. Why should they not? These sort of questions arise for the moral nihilist. Why not do it? Again, it's not to say that everyone that goes through this is going to be like this, but it becomes a point of, well, if I can get away with it, if I can learn to be secretive, if I can learn to hide things, this becomes a motivation for that particular thing. And even if you start to understand this sort of utilitarian, hedonistic sort of approach to right and wrong or good, you know, if you're motivated just by sheer pleasure, and if you're in a big supermarket or in a huge corporation, and you come to the understanding that if you take this particular thing, that this company isn't really even going to notice, it's not going to affect them. You know, they're earning billions. What are they going to know about that? It literally just becomes a question of, well, if I can get away with it, they're not experiencing harm, or the harm that they're experiencing is negligible. It's minimal, hardly anything at all. If they even notice it, you know, it could be so minute that it doesn't even register. Whereas the pleasure that they gain from that would certainly outweigh that. And so from these kind of perspectives, cultivating this ability to hide things, to be secretive, to be sneaky, could even be seen as a virtue insofar as it transforms something from being evil into either neutral or good. You know, so in this idea of, because I have come across people who claim to be moral nihilists and utilitarians. They don't see this as conflicting. I happen to think there is a conflict in the values of both of these principles, but some people seem to hold them anyway. And so they'll hold these moral nihilistic positions, refer to moral discourse as a myth, yet still take these notions of utilitarianism pain and pleasure being things which should be achieved or avoided. You know, and in this case, if you can hide things sufficiently well so that it doesn't hurt anybody else but causes you a lot of pleasure, typically these things may be considered immoral to the average person. But if you can hide them, you've transferred something from immoral, because it only becomes immoral in this sense if someone sees it as that. These are just subjective, arbitrary whims of a society. The moral nihilist looks at this as, or can look at this as, just pathetic and unjustified. And again, there's no duty here. There's no reason why they necessarily have to follow it. So this motivates this sort of creative approach to value, to your engagement with the world, to the society you live in. And this is also expressed in a really, really popular video by Kierkegaard, in a nutshell. I can never say that word properly. Kierkegaard, however you say it, in a nutshell. And they did a video called Optimistic Nihilism. Me and Brother Sabor as well, we did a commentary on this. So if you search on his channel, Optimistic Nihilism Muslim Response, you'll probably come across this. And at 3 minutes and 45 seconds, the video makes the following claim: you only get one shot at life, which is scary, but it also sets you free. If the universe ends in a heat death, every humiliation you suffer in your life will be forgotten. Every mistake you will make will not matter in the end. Every bad thing you did will be voided. If our life is all we get to experience, then it's the only thing that matters. I repeat, if our life is all we get to experience, then it's the only thing that matters. If the universe has no principles, the only principles relevant are the ones we decide on. Now, this is a viral video. It's incredibly popular, and it has a huge like to dislike ratio. A lot of people are liking it. A lot of people are really inclining to the message that it gives. But they don't see the problems that are expressive in this very statement. Now, obviously, there's a number of presuppositions and axioms that the creators of this video, and very likely many of the people that were liking it, were holding on to. But, you know, for anyone who's on social media, you've seen some horrible things. Recently, there was a video of an immigrant in America. He was trying to defend his vehicle, his property, from two young girls, 13 and 15, from stealing his vehicle. There were people just watching and just recording this. Why they didn't get involved or try to help, I have no idea. They just thought that the better thing to do would be pull out the phone and record the whole thing. But he's trying his hardest to prevent these girls from stealing his vehicle. Nonetheless, they get it, they drive away, and they crash, and they kill him. And in this video, you see this man, he's lying on the floor. His face is directly on the floor. He's lifeless. He's died. And these girls are climbing out of the car, and people are just walking around. It's as if this man isn't there. It's as if there isn't a dead body. It's incredibly strange. And the two girls who effectively killed this man show no concern for him whatsoever. Not only that, one of the girls proceeds to worry more about her phone still being in the car. The car's tipped over now. The car's upside down. They've crashed it, and a man has died. Yet this person seems to care more about her phone than the life that she's just taken, and the whole process of stealing something off someone. None of that seems to register. And you can imagine her reading this and being consoled by it. You only get one shot at life, which is scary, but it sets you free. She's about as free as she wants. I want this. So what if society is going to give me grief on the internet? You know, if the universe ends in a heat death, every humiliation I suffer, be that on Twitter with viral videos of the horrible deed that I committed, every mistake I've ever made, all of that will not matter in the end. Everything will be forgotten. Any suffering I've caused, any suffering I've felt, all of that will not matter in the end. Every bad thing I did will be voided. Ultimate redemption. What's going to prevent this person from doing that? What's going to prevent that psychopath that was being shared on Twitter, who poured fuel over a kitten, set it on fire, and recorded watching this poor little creature burn to death, running around. If this person was to read this, what would he feel other than comfort? If our life is all we get to experience, then it's the only thing that matters. That is our life. I don't get to experience anybody else's life. Nobody gets to experience anyone's life other than their own. And this viral video here is making the claim that it's the only thing that matters. An absolute statement. It's the only thing that matters. If the universe has no principles, the only principle relevant are the ones we decide on, or if I'm the only one that gets to experience my life and I can't experience anyone else's, then the only ones that are relevant, if it was to be consistent, would be the ones I decide upon. Now, later on in the video, it does go on to talk about how, oh, well, it's nice if we all get along, and it tries to sort of make a sort of appeal to empathy and things like that. But these are principles. These are principles, and there's no necessary duty to decide that those are the right principles. If the universe has no principles, the only ones relevant are the ones we decide. Who's we? All of us? The globe? What if I don't like the globe? What if I don't like people? What if I'm a loner? What if I'm a bit of an introvert? What if I hate society? What if I'm the Joker type character? That not only I'm an introvert, maybe I don't even want to be. Maybe I want to engage with the world, but I'm strange. I have some quirks. I have this weird laugh that I can't help. I'm a bit awkward. Or, you know, any of these particular qualities that society itself finds distasteful or strange, and the society itself is cruel to you as a result of this. You know, you are at the butt end of society's jokes. You know, you're treated badly by your neighbors. You have no friends. Your family are horrible. Maybe you don't even have any family. It's not uncommon. Many of my friends were suffering similar issues. We were half, maybe most of us lived in fatherless households. Fathers in prison, dead, just not around. Too many families disappeared, never heard of them. You know, no parents at all. Or if the parents were present, some of them had drug problems, alcohol problems, temper problems. You know, what? SubhanAllah, this quote here was said extremely naively without really considering the audience in its totality. And again, I'm not making claims here with regards to statistics. God knows how many people are going to look at this, like the example, the extreme examples that I gave you. But we know there's at least some. And for those that are reading this kind of thing, if you accept these, even if they try to paint a pretty picture with it later, and say, you know, well, you could hold on to these principles of empathy, of caring for one another, of being nice just because it makes you feel good. What if it doesn't make you feel good? What if everyone else isn't being nice to you? It's not taking these things into consideration, and it leads to this moral nihilistic approach, because it's with regards to the principles. And another Nietzsche quote, which I find very interesting. Nietzsche says here, they are rid of the Christian God and now believe all the more firmly that they must cling to Christian morality. This is still the case now. Many of the moral principles that they hold on to are Christian moral principles or Abrahamic. You know, they derive from the religious roots. They just neglect and forget that that's where they came from. In England, one must rehabilitate oneself after every emancipation from theology by showing in a veritably awe-inspiring manner what a moral fanatic one is. You see this with the virtue signaling culture that you find present on social media at the moment. That is the penance they pay there. He's putting this at the toes of England, but this is quite a global phenomenon now. We others hold otherwise. When one gives up on the Christian faith, or in faith in general, one pulls the right to Christian morality from under one's feet. This morality is by no means self-evident. This point has been exhibited again and again, despite these English flatheads. So here he is talking specifically about the English philosophers, probably the likes of John Locke and the rest of them. They did try to build their own sort of moral philosophies. So Christianity is a system, a whole view of things thought out together. By breaking one main concept out of it, the faith in God, one breaks the whole. Nothing necessary remains in one's hands. Christianity presupposes that man does not know, cannot know what is good for him, what evil. He believes in God, who alone knows it. God is all-knowing. We are finite beings, limited, and by necessity, everything we do has gaps in it. Whenever I look at something, there's a lot that I can't look at. There's a lot that I'm missing. I never have access to the full picture, and so my picture is always lacking. And so Christianity is a command. Its origin is transcendent. It is beyond all criticism, all right to criticism. It has truth. If God is the truth, it stands and falls with faith in God. When the English actually believe that they know intuitively what is good, what is evil, when they therefore suppose that they no longer require Christianity as a guarantee of morality, we merely witness the effects of the dominion of the Christian value judgment and an expression of the strength and depth of this dominion. It has taken hold of the collective psyche to such a degree that they think it's intuitive. They don't realize how the intuitions that they have a lot of the time are the consequence of the society that they've been raised up in. They don't see how the only reason that they were able to gain many of these intuitions was a consequence of the fact that the religion that they live within had its roots deeply embedded into that society. So yeah, and so it's no longer felt. The right to such that the very conditional character of its right to existence. Such that the origin of English morality has been forgotten. Such that the very conditional character of its right to existence is no longer felt. For the English, morality is not yet a problem. And so that concludes part 2 with regards to moral nihilism. Nihilism is just seen as this myth, as a problem, but many people overlook it, and it's a general issue. You know, there are many ways that people sort of deal with this. Like I've mentioned, I've come across people that sort of incline to this utilitarianism and don't see it as a conflict, even though the whole idea of utilitarianism is to claim that there are things that are good in and of themselves, that is pleasure, happiness, and there are things that are bad and in and of themselves, that is pain or suffering. So there's problems with that, but generally it's this notion that morality is a myth, which takes this sort of moral anti-realist position and makes whatever people are saying is moral or immoral a subjective sort of opinion. They're deriving it from arbitrary whims, or from simply the dominating moral system that they happen to be embedded within. So this now moves us on to part 3. Let me see how long we've been talking. I'll try to speed this up because I've already been talking for a while. So this moves on to part 3, which is cosmic nihilism. And cosmic nihilism is related to the absence of value and purpose in a godless world, which does not have consciousness as its underlying foundation, but is rather underpinned by an unthinking, determined material substrate. Now, this is the stronger cosmic nihilist claim. With this claim, there is a potential clash for epistemic nihilism, or with epistemic nihilism, due to the number of knowledge claims that are being made here. So, for example, purpose of a godless world. So here you have the claim that the world is godless, and that the underlying foundation is underpinned by unthinking, unconscious, determined material substrate. These are also knowledge claims. Now, you've got one option as an epistemic nihilist who can't really say they know anything, who's also undermined rationality and reason. Just say, I don't really care. You know, it's just, it is what it is. Whether or not there is a contradiction, or whether you think there's a contradiction, it doesn't matter. It is what it is. It's strange because, you know, if someone's making this sort of claim, how they can even get to the point of saying this is true, because they've undermined the ability to attain truth. So they can soften it, basically. And so this softening is related to our inability to gain genuine knowledge or truth as far as they're concerned. And so they could word it differently as follows. So they could say, cosmic nihilism is related to the absence of value and purpose in a potentially godless world in which we cannot know if it has consciousness as its underlying foundation, but appears to possibly be underpinned by an unthinking, determined material substrate. And so you still get this general theme of, you know, the universe in totality, of everything being without value, without purpose. And you've got to remember here that value and purpose themselves are related to consciousness. And so the lack of consciousness at the foundation necessitates a lack of purpose and value throughout the universe. And insofar as we are little beings on this universe, or in this universe, our experiences or the qualia that we see as finding value in things are irrelevant, because we are just made up of little tiny atoms, as we're going to see now. So we look at the universe and we see that it is indifferent and actively hostile to human existence. Everything is just one big, random, mysterious accident. You look out into the void and feel nothing but the absurd approach you. Life is fundamentally just mindless molecules, which are fundamentally just weird little elusive, lifeless particles. And they all make up this very large, big, random, lifeless machine. And, you know, this view does entail that looking at existence, this view entails when you look at existence, you see it as just one big random machine. There's no real reason or value to anything. And, you know, insofar as the whole is without value or purpose, and so are its parts. Even if we do value something, who cares? From this particular perspective, the universe is destined for a heat death, as our old friends Kierkegaard had mentioned. And so nothing will have mattered anyway. Whatever we valued will be forgotten. Whatever we valued will fizzle away with the end of the universe. Now, keep in mind, this whole view is dependent on whether or not there is actually a God. If there is a God, none of this makes any sense, but the epistemological nihilist says that it doesn't matter for them. They can't even discover that. And so, yeah, keep that in mind. All of this only follows if there is a consciousness, if there is no consciousness, sorry, at the foundation of existence. None of this is argumentation or proves God's non-existence. That's key to remember here. We're talking about the experience or the consequences of this pessimism, the state of being that this person looks at the world through, and the sort of reasoning that they go through, and the kind of conclusions that are the consequence of many of the causes that we went through in lecture 2. Now, so that's cosmic nihilism. The universe is itself in totality without value, without purpose. And this segues very nicely into existential nihilism. And you'll probably notice as well, there's many linking points between all of these different categories, between all of these parts, how they interrelate. But existential nihilism, so as we mentioned there, with cosmic nihilism, the whole is without value. Everything in that, you know, all of it together is without purpose, without value. And if the whole thing is without value, without purpose, if cosmic nihilism is true, then by greater reason, existential nihilism is true. If the whole thing is without value, and this thing is much bigger than I am, there's a lot more going on here. How can I, as an individual, have any value? If the universe is without value, how can a part of it have value? That's the main point here. If a part of it values itself or values another part, what more is this than simply saying something insignificant finds something else insignificant to be significant? It's another way of simply saying that the part is delusional. The part is experiencing something other than what is the case. It's finding value in something in which there is no value. And this quote unquote realization or this experience is what we're referring to now as existential nihilism. This idea that ultimately the human race, the human being, is fundamentally delusional for the most part. It just doesn't map onto reality. And, you know, this is certainly the case for the positive atheist, that is the atheist which is otherwise known as the atheist proper or atheism proper. So atheism more recently has been sort of categorized into three forms. You have atheism proper, which is the positive atheist that says there is no God. You have the agnostic, or the soft atheist, who says that he cannot know if God does or does not exist. And then you have the there's another one, I can't remember what that one is, but that just says that metaphysical language, I think, to some degree is meaningless. But the point is if someone is a positive atheist, an atheist proper, they wouldn't necessarily be an epistemological nihilist, because in this case they could say they know that there is no God. Obviously, I would claim that this is an absurd view, but some people do hold this position. How many? Allahu alam. And they put forward this claim. They say there is no God, and if that is the case, then cosmic nihilism follows necessarily. And if cosmic nihilism follows, then so does existential nihilism. And so, you know, this conclusion here follows necessarily from positive atheism, and it follows as a possibility or inductively from the case of the soft atheist, or from agnosticism, which probably or can be related to the position of the epistemic nihilism. So, you know, there's different forms here, and it relates to different forms of atheism in different ways. But in any case, you know, that without that value, in any case, that without value values the valueless as though it has value. All of this is, you know, an absurd mentality to hold from this position. And so this existential angst, this existential nihilism is, you know, this is the kind of conclusion that's being come to. But again, you know, we're making the argument here that this follows from the conditions in the second lecture. This experience doesn't, for the most part, contain the recognition of this, but it acts as though it really does have value. So when the average human being is looking at the world and valuing things, and even the person that might even consider themselves a nihilist, you know, if you try to take the phone for them, they're going to get upset. Why? Because they value the phone. If you hold a knife up to them, they might panic. Why? Because they value their life. Obviously, we're not recommending anyone do anything stupid like that, but the point here is that they still value things, and in this experience they act as though they value, or they do value, but through this mindset, or through this symptom, or this, you know, this effect that people might be experiencing, that is of existential nihilism, this is seen as delusional. And, you know, it's simple. You can just look at this. So this is you, or any particular form of life, and, you know, the cosmic nihilist argues here that we have a false sense of grandeur, that we see ourselves as a center, as important, as significant, and we care about what we do as though our actions matter, or as if someone else's actions matter. We care about what others do, like it means anything. But as far as they're concerned, the reality is we are insignificant. The grand scheme of things, we're not even a speck. And in a way, from a particular path of thinking, you know, even the Muslims here would agree with this particular part. However, we make our comparison to the creator, unlike them, the atheist, for example, or the explicit existential nihilist. So I think this may answer a question someone's already asked. So we do agree to a degree, with moral nihilism, but the issue here is that this is in comparison to the creator, whereas the disbeliever, the one who doesn't believe, is making this comparison to the rest of creation. And they look at us compared to all of creation and come to the conclusion we are insignificant compared to that. And if everything is insignificant, we are so by a greater degree. Whereas we look at God, or we compare ourselves to the majesty of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and we say we are insignificant compared to that. Now, obviously, there are different things being negated here. Now, in relation to the creation, and without reference to a creator, everything becomes meaningless. Everything becomes without purpose. However, our insignificance, when taken in relation to a creator, that doesn't rob everything of meaning. That doesn't make everything insignificant, because everything is the result of the creative act of that being. Everything has been created with a purpose, with a function, with there is value in these things insofar as they have been made by a creator. Obviously, that in itself isn't an argument for a creator. And if anyone is interested in maybe seeing some more arguments for that, do check out the Thought Adventure podcast, because we do go into these in a lot of detail. I think we're 6 episodes in at the moment, and we explore this in a lot of depth. Arguments for the existence of a necessary being, inferences from the necessary being to the existence of a God. In future episodes, we're going to start talking about moving from the existence of a God to the Islamic concept of that. And you'll find a lot of literature being published on the Sapience Institute with regards to this. And there are a lot of videos being pumped out as well. So just keep your eyes on all of these different platforms, if you want to kind of go into these in more detail. But yeah, so in answer to that, value here isn't negated. Let's see what I've written here. And creation in its whole pales in comparison, but derives its value through the creator rather than having its value negated. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. Now, in the grand scheme of things, again, nothing we do will matter. This is where this type of thinking departs from religious thinking, because we believe that obviously if everything is created by God and we are created by God, we are created with a purpose and a function. Everything you do does matter. Things aren't insignificant. Your actions hold infinite, eternal consequences. You will live forever in an afterlife, and your deeds have been weighed, and how you live in that afterlife is determined by how you act. So these deeds, these actions do matter, but from the existential nihilist perspective, this has all been put into question. All of this is doubted and pushed away. The ability to achieve knowledge is doubted. Moral existence is doubted. Everything is becoming doubted. Everything loses its value. Answers to the question why cannot be found, and you end up with this. And basically, you look into the skies, we confirm just how tiny we are and how our actions are limited to our tiny bubble where we have incredibly limited causal effect. And this paralyzes people to many degrees. Now, you can see here that all of these contribute to a feeling of existential dread. It begins looking outwardly at the world, but ultimately reflects back upon itself. So you've got your epistemic nihilism, your moral nihilism, cosmic nihilism. These are looking outwardly. How do we come to know things? How do we know what's right and wrong with regards to actions towards things that are out in the external world? The cosmic nihilism is looking at the universe in a totality. And then at the end of all of this, at the end of looking at this, it reflects upon itself and begins to experience the absurd. And so, as you remember from previous lectures, this ties into the notion that was given by Thomas Nagel. And he says the notion of the absurd is born out of the conflict of two things. One, the natural human need and inclination for meaning and reason. And two, the subjective experience of the unreasonable silence of the world. You're looking out into the world and you're not getting any answers. You're not coming to the conclusions that satiate this thirst that we have. And this is what ends up being considered the experience of the absurd. How is it that we have this natural need, this inclination for meaning and reason, and we are completely incapable of fulfilling it? It's expressive again of an impatience. The fact that you can't necessarily get these answers now doesn't mean you won't get them ever, as one. And so a sense of a sense of patience, if practiced by a person, is something itself which can deteriorate the experience of the absurd. Maybe the answers will arrive, but there's particular conclusions that have been reached here, that the universe is unreasonably silent, and it also sort of suggests that it will continue to be unreasonably silent, that the answers are not abstractable from the world. And so you end up with this experience of the absurd. And how can it express itself is the question here. We can talk about how this nihilism, or this feeling of the absurd, can express itself in a number of ways. We could talk about how it expresses itself on an individual. So how one particular person, when suffering from nihilism, might deal with the world, how he might direct his reaction to this problem towards himself or to others. Or we can talk about it collectively, how a society or a group or a collective, how they may react to this, be that within themselves, to each other, or to others, to people outside of that collective. And it can express itself in two ways as well. So either passive or active. So when it's directed to the self or to others, that's one way of describing it. When it's directed to itself in a passive or an active way, passive could be suggested in terms of sort of depression, spending a lot of time inside, being quite submissive, avoiding, engaging in escapism, things like heavy addiction to computer games, antisocial behavior in the sense that you're just not dealing with the social world, you're not going out. This is passive nihilism. It's not characterized by a lot of action. Active nihilism could be expressed in the sense of either committing suicide. You're taking active steps to sort of overcome this. Or if it's outwardly projected, it could express itself in the sense of mass shootings. Now, obviously, again, I've got to kind of constantly say this. This isn't to say that this is the majority outcome of those that experience these problems. I'm happy to admit that this is a minority of those who suffer from nihilism end up engaging in destructive behavior, be that towards themselves or to others. But it is common enough that it's a problem. It's common enough that it's still upsetting. If you look at the levels of suicide, like we did in the first lecture, this is, I would say, necessarily expressive of this active nihilism towards oneself. The passive nihilists you might be able to describe as those who attempt it but fail. They're not really doing too good at it, or those who are just simply suffering from depression, for which the numbers are very high. But when we're talking about these, we're just talking about the spectrum in the ways that this can express itself. We're not talking about the percentage of how this particular form of it relates to the whole. So yeah, active nihilism, passive nihilism. We can talk about the individual or collectively, whether it's self-directed, other-directed, and how all of these fall into forms of escapism. How do I avoid this nihilism? How do I overcome it? Is it completely destructive, or do I go into this period of creativity where we can just kind of do as and what we want? Meaning is whatever I want it to be. All of these kind of things. What kind of escapisms are there? There's different forms. There's self-hypnosis and techno-hypnosis. So these sort of self-willed forms of hypnotic behavior where you can sort of get yourself into a trance. You find this with gaming, with binging on Netflix, or any other sort of streaming device, even things like YouTube, social media scrolling, just endlessly going through the social media platforms with no end. These are all forms of self-hypnosis and of avoiding the realities you're experiencing, that sort of express themselves in this form of nihilism. It can also express itself in obsessive behaviors. So, the typical mantra: sex, drugs, and rock and roll, or more specifically, sex, drugs, music, alcohol, gambling, etc. All of these sort of behaviors that can become quite addictive, and they are used to avoid reflection on life and on the position that they're in, and on sort of continuing down that rabbit hole that they found themselves in. As we will see when we sort of get towards lecture 4, that if you're going through this, or you know someone that's going through it, you have to continue down that path. You have to keep on reflecting, and sometimes it can cause a lot of pain, and this process itself can be quite a dangerous one. As obviously we've mentioned earlier, this does lead to people committing suicide sometimes, and so there needs to be people helping them along this process. There needs to be people that show that they care, and this makes a huge difference. When people have to go through this alone, this is when it generally becomes a lot more dangerous. But you know, if they can see a light at the end of the tunnel, simply having someone there, it can be expressive of that light, and so it gives them something to move towards and to overcome. But again, this existential nihilism can lead to these sort of obsessive behaviors, simply to avoid facing the problems that they're going through. Destructive, as we mentioned, self-destructive, other destructive, suicidal, killing, minority to the total, but still present. And it can also lead to a fractured society. So, you know, you combine this with the lack of social duty that we found with moral nihilism. This leads to increased levels of corruption. If the society as a whole doesn't feel any necessary reasons, if they don't feel like there's something watching them over and above, and insofar as they can hide it and get rid of it, it would take a very particular kind of person to not go against that grain, if they have the ability to be able to hide it, to be able to be sneaky, to be able to think that they can be corrupt and get away with it. And we see growing levels of corruption around the world, so it's not unheard of, it's not uncommon. It happens quite a lot, enough to see it as an issue. And then obviously this fractured society leads or is connected to this idea of the post-truth world, where people are just picking and choosing. You see this political gap widening. So there's Pew studies that talk about the political overlap has deteriorated quite greatly over the years. I think it was only 20 years ago there was quite a lot of political overlap between the two parties that generally play in politics, be that in the UK or in America, the left wing and right wing, Democrats, Republicans. There was a lot of political overlap, but more recently that political overlap has deteriorated to the point where there is hardly anything in common between the parties anymore. And it's an interesting study on Pew Research if you check that out. But it's expressive of this fractured society, this chasm opening up between the people. That's not expressive of a border. You can't just draw a line on a map here and say, well, this part of the UK is this part of the UK is that. Like these divides can occur on the same street, they can occur within the same family, they can occur within the same household. They, you know, the fracturing is a very peculiar one, where if you were to draw a line, it'd be a very wobbly, long one, and it would go all over the place. But yeah, so you've got this kind of political gap widening. You have the increase of this sort of revolutionary and activist mentality, and this also leads to this sort of accelerationist mentality as well. I have a particular theory that I think the only way that Donald Trump ended up getting into power was because a lot of people saw that he would be possibly, this is possible, obviously this is a hypothesis, but it's an interesting one. They saw him as if he was to get into power, that would justify a revolutionary mentality. And so if you wanted to egg on the end, if you've got this sort of communist mentality, for example, and you want to see the collapse of a particular system, what would be the best way of getting that done? If we put this crazy guy in power, in place, that would justify a revolution. If we can get the worst possible character. And so I think obviously there's a lot of fans of his, so he does have his fan base. He does have a huge portion of the people that did vote for him and generally thought that he was the solution to their problems. But I do think that there was probably many people who hated him that voted him in anyway, because that would have justified this sort of revolutionary mentality. But again, you see this being expressed on places like YouTube, that there is a talk of accelerationism, and this is also expressive. You see this in pop culture. So how the end of the world has been sort of romanticized. You see the increase of things like the zombie game industry, or the the series that sort of go along this line, where you have this sort of apocalypse occur, and people love it. People absolutely eat it up, especially in the gaming industry. These are some of the most popular games. You have DayZ, for example. There's huge channels that have been produced as a result of these kind of games, where people get to live this end of the world scenario. And many of them, especially the youth, constantly think, oh, it'd be sick if this happened. I'd boss it, you know, I'd just go straight to the gun store, I'd go straight to here, I'd be building, you know, I'd thrive in that kind of environment. And you know, this is expressive of an accelerationism, that is the willing of the end to occur, which seems to be on the rise at the moment, becoming more popular. And it's probably a consequence of this political gap widening as well. Like the political gap has become quite big, and people, it's hard to get perspective when there's such a large population. And so it's difficult to determine who's actually got the power. So you see the right wing cliques sort of complaining about how the left wing have all the power and how they're destroying the world, and the lefties are doing this and that. And then you have the right wing, the left wing saying the same things. I know it's patriarchy, the right wing, conservative powers, they have control, they're the ones. And everyone's sort of blaming all the problems on the opposite sides. And the gap has kind of become so wide, and the positions becoming so extreme. Like, for example, abortion being a really good example of this. You have one camp sort of wanting or allowing abortion to varying degrees, but they're fine with it. And then you have another camp saying abortion shouldn't be practiced, or shouldn't be legalized, shouldn't be made so easily accessible. And obviously there's varying degrees, but for the most part they sit on opposite camps, pro-life or pro-abortion, or pro-choice as they call it. Yeah, and so you've got these rise of these problems, and I would say that these are, again, consequences of a lot of these issues that we've been going through today. The conditions that gave rise to this social nihilism in its many forms, and the consequences of that, which we've completed today. And so, last thoughts and a general overview. We went through the 4 stages, or the 4 particular categories. We talked about epistemological nihilism and the problems that are outlined there, how it's driven by this hyperskepticism, the ability to attain knowledge becomes questioned completely, and people are just left in never-ending doubts, doubt after doubt after doubt after doubt. And the second category that we covered, let me just double check that. The second category was moral nihilism, and how, you know, moral facts become impossible to attain, or the moral language is itself incorrect, or it should be seen through this state of frame of mind as a myth, and we should adopt a sort of storytelling mentality when dealing with morality. But ultimately, moral language is incorrect. We also spoke about cosmic nihilism, that is the universe itself not having any value necessarily, or any purpose, and then this having a lead on or a bleed into existential nihilism, that is the experience of our life, not just the universe, but the life of particular people having no value, and the problems entailed with that. And so these are all consequences of the issue of nihilism, and how it can become destructive either to the self or to others, to the individual, to the collective, passively or actively. And these are huge issues that face society as a whole, and I'm going as far as to argue globally. And so hopefully, having gone through lectures 2 and 3, this should feed back now into lecture 1, where I was making the argument that it is an important subject, one that we should be looking into and should be trying to understand in order to be able to overcome it. I am confident that Islam is an answer to this. I am confident that a lot of these problems that have been raised, Islam can be given as an antidote to them, and can not only obviously bring people out of these problems or pull people out of this pit, but help them to build. They give them a foundation from which to step on. And as Allah says in the Quran, those who hold firm to the rope of Allah cannot go astray. They have something firm to hold on to. And inshallah, next week we're going to go into that in the last lecture of this series, lecture 4, and we'll leave that there for today. Forgive me, I've been trying to keep these short, so the intention, like I did one episode on this, I think last year in July, and I had to squeeze all of this into one, and that one ended up being like 3-4 hours long or something stupid. It was really, really long. And so after discussing things with Brother Hamza Sources, he suggested we do a 4-part series, and I was just kind of hoping that maybe I could break that 3-4 hours to 1 hour a piece. But it turns out that because I was restricted to one lecture, I could have talked much longer, but I sort of rushed it, and so it ended up being a lot shorter. And these have still been quite long, so I think on average it's been about a 2 hour. I think the first one was 2 hours plus a half an hour Q&A at the end. The third one was about 2.5 hours with a half an hour Q&A, and this one has been 2 hours, and I'm going to leave it with for another half an hour Q&A. Let me turn off this split screen so you can see me. Let me close this screen. There we go. So let's move on to the Q&A. I just want to ask, obviously, thank you to everyone who's been with us. Let's see, there's still 22 of you, alhamdulillah. So Barakallah Feek for powering through this absolute lengthy lecture series with me. So feel free, in the software that you're using, you should have the ability to ask questions. So please do check them out. Wa alaikum salam to everyone who's saying assalamu alaikum. Ask your questions and I'll try to go through them as quickly as I can for about half an hour. So how long have we been going now? Let's have a look. We've been going for 2 hours and 6 minutes. When it gets to 2 hours and 30, I'm going to stop. But bismillah. So we've got one from here from Sambana. Assalamu alaikum. Brother Yusuf, wa alaikum salam. I sent you an email, but you may not have had time to read it. Please respond by elaborating on the concept of values undermining themselves. Yeah, so it's basically, when someone values something, they see that as important. I do go over this quite in depth in the first lecture. So when that one is released, I just recommend watching that again, but I'll go over it quickly again. A value undermining itself is basically, we hold something important, and in holding a particular thing to be important, this thing itself causes either a chain effect or directly undermines itself and gives a motivation to stop valuing it, or that the thing itself makes it or reveals that this thing shouldn't be valued in experience. Not necessarily that it shouldn't be, but the person that holds this value goes down a path that ends up kicking its own feet from underneath it. So I gave a number of examples. Reason is a really easy one. So if you hold reason as a higher value, the idea of this higher value undermining itself would be the process of, well, the reason holds particular ideas within this concept. And so within that is the idea of a fallacy or faulty reasoning. And one of these fallacies is known as circular reasoning, that is, or begging the question. The thing that you're arguing for is presupposed in the argument itself, or in the propositions leading to a conclusion. So you have a number of propositions. An argument is generally, at minimum, 1 or 2 propositions. So you have proposition 1, proposition 2, leading to a conclusion. And so if the conclusion is to be found in the propositions that are being used to justify the conclusion, this is called circular reasoning. It's called begging the question. You're presupposing the thing you're trying to get someone to believe, and then it leads to the thing that you hope to convince them of, but it's already present in the conclusions. So when it comes to reason, it's like, why do we value reason? Why should we value reason or value logic? And it's this process of reasoning itself which turns, so you've got to turn reason upon itself, basically, and say, well, why is reason a higher value? And the only way to really justify that, if reason is a higher value, is with a reasoned argument. But the problem is that's presupposing that reason is valuable in the first place in order to justify that reason is valuable. So you've got this fallacious process. And the only way you can really justify reason without falling into fallacious reasoning is to appeal to something beyond reason itself. So you're appealing to reason from an intuitive sense. We intuitively have reason, or you maybe try to make some sort of a priori argument to sort of justify it, but you've still got these problems that you're appealing to an argument for the justification, even if you're appealing to intuition. So reason turns itself upon itself and undermines itself if it's held as a higher value, or the highest value. Another option, another example of that was truth. So truth for Nietzsche was seen as being underpinned by morality, and so Nietzsche said that, you know, if you commit to truth and you study the world, as far as he was concerned, you know, if you look at anthropology, if you look at the study of the different moral systems across the planet, that this leads to this sort of descriptive moral relativism, which ultimately then undermines morality itself. And if truth was a moral value, and truth gave rise to the undervaluing of morality, then that knocks the pillar that held truth up in the first place and devalues truth. But the whole process itself of devaluing truth was began by the state of valuing truth in the first place. So that is what we mean by a higher value undermining itself. I hope that makes sense. I know it could be a bit convoluted. Sometimes you just need to sort of re-listen to these things. Lecture 3 is going to be uploaded as well. So just keep an eye on them. I'll get on Hamza to try to upload them as soon as possible. And obviously the answers that I'm giving to these questions should be present at the end of that lecture as well. So you ask another question. You gave the example of Nietzsche talking about truth undermining morality, but I'm confused as to what this actually means. Yeah, so I'm hoping that there should have explained it. So for Nietzsche was looking at the world. So he was looking at all these different moral systems, and he's saying here that truth undermines morality because there are so many moral systems. So he's taking this route through moral relativism, or descriptive moral relativism. He's saying there's all these moral systems. How can any of them be true? There are answers to this. It's not necessarily a necessary conclusion. You don't need to move from there to moral nihilism. Some people move from there to meta-ethical moral relativism. So they're still holding this sort of moral realist position, and claim that there are still moral facts about the world. They're just relative to context. They're relative to the society. So that's another position. Or you can simply say that, you know, from the Islamic perspective, we would look at this and say, well, no, everyone started on one particular moral system, or that everyone was on that one particular religion, the one that was given to Adam alayhi salam. And then as the people grew and developed and different communities sprouted and went onwards, they developed these moral systems creatively, and it gave rise to adaptions, and you end up with these very different moral systems, all of them which have a common theme. You know, for example, they all have this sense of supernatural, of life after death, of the soul and things like that. And these all carry with them a sense and notion of justice, which is in relation to an afterlife, within relation to an eternal judgment. That you know, that's how we would approach it. But for Nietzsche, he didn't see it as that. Like he was sort of suffering from this idea that truth itself was sort of difficult to attain, and he was just looking at what was the case with regards to all of these moral systems, and ended up taking a sort of epistemologically nihilistic approach to some degree, although not completely. He's a bit of a weird one. Like I say, he's a wild card. But he was basically saying that truth undermines morality. Truth was underpinned by morality. So insofar as it undermines morality itself, it undermines truth. So truth undermines itself. That's all that means. Please, can you direct me to the recordings? So yeah, like I say, they've not been uploaded yet, but they will be uploaded to the website, sapiensinstitute.org, and to the YouTube channel. So just keep your eye out for them, and they should be available soon, inshallah. So we have another question here. Yes, here we go. So doesn't Islam also kind of promote nihilism, that this life is meaningless in comparison to the next? I mean, every major religion has had groups which have taken a nihilistic attitude. Yeah, but you missed a part of that sentence. So you said, doesn't Islam also kind of promote nihilism, that this life is meaningless in comparison to the next? Yes, but it's not just meaningless in comparison to the next. They are connected. They're not. There's not this chasm between them. The connection is in terms of how you act in this world, and insofar as things are done in the name of God. If you act in this world and live in a way obedient to God and to His commands, then life becomes meaningful. But without that concept, life becomes nihilistic. So we would agree with regards to that. But we don't believe that life is without meaning. We don't believe that life is without purpose. Allah says in the Quran, do you think we made you in jest? We made you with purpose to worship Allah. And so it's if you're looking at the Quran and you're looking at the Islamic position, it is quote unquote objectively the case. I say quote unquote because for those of you who are familiar with me, I'm not too fond of the distinction. It is absolutely the case. It's probably a better way of putting it. It is absolutely the case that from the Islamic paradigm that life is meaningful. We agree with the nihilists that we say, well, if there is no God, then life is nihilism. And the distinction here is with that condition, without God, or lived without God in mind, or lived without the intention to please Allah, life is meaningless. But we differ here from the nihilist in that we believe God is knowable, we believe God exists, and we have a genuine sincerity in that belief, and we therefore do not experience nihilism in that sense, insofar as we recognize that there obviously, if you see nihilism as a sickness, like I've been explaining it, even if someone does end up experiencing nihilism while being a theist, it's not the consequence of the religion, because the religion absolutely negates it. It says, no, you have been created with purpose. It's a consequence of particular conditions. That is, you're overwhelmed by information, you don't really know how to deal with things, you're not really being provided with the right tools to be able to overcome these problems. Be that from neglect of the community, not really upholding their obligations for the community itself, or any kind of thing like that. But yeah, so there is a nihilistic element, but it's a conditional one, and we negate the condition which necessitates nihilism, and we call people away from it. So we say, no. If you don't believe in God, and if you're not worshiping Him, if you're worshiping false idols, be that other gods, like a polytheistic notion of it, or of men, or of your own desires, as Allah says in the Quran, they take their own desires as gods. Insofar as they're doing that, they're living a nihilistic life, because ultimately everything they do is for nothing. Everything they do is just going to kind of end terribly for them. Insofar as they repent from that, they turn around and they focus solely on God and submit to Him, then at that point everything is transformed and everything becomes meaningful, because it's fulfilling the function, the purpose that it was made to fulfill. What is logic according to Islam? When you say according to Islam, it depends what you mean. So we could say that Allah has created the world so that it is knowable, like that we can engage with it, and we've been given faculties so that we can engage with it and we can understand it. Logic is basically just the necessary connections between statements. So a statement is logical insofar as there is a flow and a connection from one premise to the next, which necessarily leads to a sound conclusion. That is, a sound argument. So the conclusion is true insofar as the premises are true and that the argument is valid. And an argument is valid insofar as there is this necessary connection. So if A then B, A therefore B. This would be considered logic. Logic is just a description of the relation between statements. It's not necessarily just like an Islamic approach there, but that's a descriptive one. If we're talking about the rational faculties, we're talking about a faculty which has been instilled in us for us to be able to engage with the world and to come to truth through that process. But it's one that we've been given specifically in order to achieve a certain task. And obviously, with that in mind, we're understanding the fundamental being is God. He creates the world and he's created it with purpose and function in mind. And so logic works insofar as it sort of facilitates that goal in achieving truth, in achieving a recognition of our purpose in life. Good question. I'll probably have to think about it, and maybe even that might be a good title for an essay. What is logic? Assalamu alaikum, Yusuf. Wa alaikum salam. Could you share the link to the previous recordings I've joined? Yeah, so like I said, they are available. They need to be uploaded. And when they are uploaded, they will be present on the Sapience Institute website. So just keep an eye on there. Go on to the Sapience Institute YouTube channel, subscribe, click the bell and turn on all notifications. And when it is uploaded on the YouTube channel, you'll be notified. Otherwise, just keep an eye on the channel or on the website, sapiencinstitute.org. It will be present on there at some point. We've got 10 minutes left. Wa'ayak, to those of you who said Jazakallah Khair. True, Trump is an anarchist. What were the 3 books you mentioned at the start? You'll have to remind me which 3 books. At the start of what? At the start of this lecture or at the start of lecture 1? Because I don't recall which ones you're referring to. So we've got another comment here from Brother Stephen. We love you, Yusuf. We love you too, bro. I love the link between epistemological nihilism and agnosticism, cosmological nihilism and atheism. Could you elaborate on the other types of nihilism and the typically actualized worldview? So in terms of elaborating, I've already gone into quite a lot of detail on those particular things, and to elaborate, especially with me only having really 7 minutes left, I'm not sure I can go into it in much more detail that would maybe draw much more out at the moment. If you want, Brother Steve, we can talk privately because you've got me on WhatsApp, so just send me a message and we can have a chat if you want to go into it. But in terms of like elaborating on the other types of nihilism, so you've mentioned here epistemological and cosmological. So the other 2 were moral nihilism and existential. Like I say, I think I've already really gone into them quite a lot, so I don't want to go into it too much more, unless there's a more specific question you've got with regards to moral nihilism or existential nihilism, because that was a very general question. So if you could make it a bit more specific, then inshallah I can go for it. I've got another question here. Salam Yusuf, wa alaikum salam. I read that Generation Z is the nihilistic generation. Do you think that this is fair label? Because nihilism is not a new phenomena, always been around. I would say every generation is going to be more nihilistic if trends are going the way they are. That's quite, again, anecdotal. What research, how would you even research that exactly? Maybe you could make a relation to the increase of techno-escapism or techno-hypnosis. You know, the more dependent people become on escaping the world or escaping existence into fantasy, like gaming and things like that. I guess if you're looking at the coming generations as being more prone to these kind of things, maybe you can make the argument here that they're seeing life as being pretty crappy, so they have to escape in this fantasy, and the conditions are allowing that. You know, so they've got their basic needs being supplied for. Poverty is decreasing in, you know, the Western world in particular, to the point where it facilitates this escapism, and so it sort of creates this nasty feedback loop and allows that nihilistic phenomena to sort of develop more readily in the younger generation. Whether that is the case is I guess, if you want to argue absolutely, you need to do some sort of research. I guess this is a job for the sociologists, the psychologists, to really sort of dig into. You know, if you've got a basic understanding of what nihilism is, with these 4 particular concepts we've gone through today, it's not going to be impossible for people to start engaging in studies and to try to get to the best explanation, or as close to, obviously, if you're sort of giving these principles, or if you're holding them, you might not necessarily going to be motivated to go on this task. But insofar as you think knowledge is possible, and that it's not a hopeless endeavor, like myself, for example, I don't think it is impossible, and I think we can progress and develop with recourse to the best explanations. And I think this is in itself motivation, so that there should be increased studies, and that's, I guess, the purpose of this set of lectures as well, in my essays, is to motivate people to look into it more, and to engage in studies and try to decide or see if we can collect a bit of data to see how many people sort of fall into any of these particular nihilistic categories. I think that would be incredibly interesting, and it would help my research a lot as well. What is the logic according to Islam, and how is it taught as compared to atheist definition of logic? It's not really made distinct. So if, you know, the ulama, they would often be taught Aristotelian logic. So basically it's understanding that there are a particular set of logical laws that must be abided by when talking about or making statements or arguments. So you put an argument forward, and it must follow a logical consistency. It must be valid. That is, there must be necessary connection between each statement. For example, if I say Socrates is a mortal, Socrates is a human, all humans are mortal, therefore Socrates is a mortal. You've made a necessary connection between the 2 premises. So you're saying all A's are B's, so all A's are B's. A is a B. Sorry, all A's are B's. Socrates is an A, therefore Socrates is a B. And so there is this connection, and you can see the connection when you break it down and you sort of turn it into algebra, or you replace the statements into a generic term or symbol. You can see how the premises connect and how they link necessarily to the conclusion. There's not necessarily a difference between the 2 in terms of how it's practiced. In terms of the explanation for its origins, that's maybe where we would differ. But the explanation for its origins doesn't necessarily differ in terms of how we use it practically, but it might affect the consequences of it. So when we were talking, for example, about epistemological nihilism and how logic itself might be seen as something that develops with the human being, how that might undermine logic, like Edmund Husserl was saying in that quote that I gave you. And in that case, it would have a consequence, but its practice would remain the same as it's used in the Islamic paradigm. That is, we're looking at statements and we're saying that certain things suggest certain things, you know, that this connection makes the argument valid. And insofar as it's valid, if it is valid, if the premises can be shown to be true, in a valid argument, the conclusion is necessarily true. You know, it's just the process of engaging and looking at argumentation and trying to discover truth through that wouldn't really differ. Again, it's literally just in terms of the origin story and in terms of how we understand the origins, that can affect how we understand how we should approach it or deal with it, or whether it's something we can say it affects our epistemology. To what degree we can say we can achieve knowledge. If logic itself becomes undermined, then that also means that it undermines our use of it as a tool to achieve knowledge or truth. Half of the time, atheists neglect it. We don't really talk about this problem too much. You got to kind of force them into that conversation, and then even then, it's like it just pull the mystery card. And it's not like we don't have a lot of when we're making a recourse to God for this faculty being God given, we're not explaining the whole process of how it was created or anything like this. So there's certain gaps in our knowledge in terms of how we use it, and certain leaps of faith here as well. In both spheres, the atheist is making leaps of faith. The theist is making leaps of faith. And if you want to look again at arguments as to why leaps of faith are necessary and not this dirty word or not this bad thing, read my dissertation, part 2. I go into that. These 4 categories, let's have a look at how much time I got. Right, so it's 2 hours 30 minutes. So I'll read this last question, and then I'll have to go. I'll tell you what, if you all promise not to ask any more questions, so that I can see here, the last one was asked by Riyad Uddin. So don't ask any more questions. Once I get to this one, I'll finish there, inshallah. So bear with me. So we've got here these 4 categories of nihilism. Can it be the case that a person starts experiencing epistemological nihilism and then progresses to existential, or can it start from any of the 4? Yeah, good question. I guess it could, because the thing is these 4 categories that I'm giving you, these aren't the start. So I'm giving you these as consequences. Now, if someone's not necessarily suffering from nihilism and they start to engage in this, it's going to be these again are the consequences. These are the effects. The causes we were mentioning at the beginning in lecture 2. So the causes are more likely to be the fact that this person is becoming overwhelmed. This person is beginning from like a state of pessimism, or in the process of going through it, they get overwhelmed and become pessimistic, and so on and so forth. Or that they're experiencing problems to do with alienation. What was the other ones? So yeah, so you've got to make the distinction between the 4 categories that we've gone through today. These are causes. These are effects. These are effects. These are things that are following from being a nihilist, or being like evaluating the world as a nihilist. It's already sort of presupposed in the evaluation. It's not a necessary outcome, only insofar as people are sort of dealing with a certain state of or frame of mind. But yeah, I guess if you're not really beginning from this position, so you're not experiencing it as a poison, so or a sickness, and you're fine, you start engaging in this, you could start your studies at any one of them. You could start looking into epistemological nihilism, and become convinced of particular arguments being put forward there, and that have a knock-on effect leading to the other 4. I don't see how, if you're not an epistemological nihilist or if you're not a moral nihilist, how you could go into reading about existential nihilism and then becoming the others, unless it just kind of motivated you or raised an interest to look into the others, and then it led back. So if you, for example, you start reading about existential nihilism, you're not necessarily going to become one at the end of that. But existential nihilism may motivate you to go and study epistemological nihilism, and then when you study that, you might start to become, suffer from these problems of being overwhelmed. So there can be this sort of feedback loop between these 2 areas. So you're living in a world where nihilism has already taken effect, and the causes of nihilism are present around you. And so insofar as you're engaging with these causes, you can become to get affected as well. And it's contagious in this sense, I guess. Yeah, but it's interesting. Good question. Where are we to access those podcasts the brother mentioned on YouTube. So Thought Adventure Podcast. If you go to Google or go to YouTube and search Thought Adventure Podcast, they will show up, and they should now as well be on all major podcast platforms. So if you are on Apple Podcasts and you search Thought Adventure Podcast, it should come up. Or if you search anything in general on if you search on Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, they should all be present there. And we're discussing a lot of these questions to do with arguments for the existence of God, whether the Trinity is rational. The problems of consciousness was a really good one with Brother Hamza. He was present on that podcast. It was a really good one. So do check them out, inshallah. Jazakallah khair and wa'ayak. Please, are those who believe in nihilism considered as kuffars? Yeah, if you believe in nihilism, then you would be a disbeliever. If you believe that the world is without purpose, you're negating the words of Allah in the Quran, and you might not necessarily be aware of it. So this person, you've got to keep in mind there are different kinds of disbelief. So there are those who disbelieve actively, so they are knowledgeable, they are aware of the commands of Allah, they are aware of His book, of His teachings, of His messengers, and they reject them. That's one kind of disbeliever. So the polytheists, for example, the Quraysh, they would fall under that particular category. And then there are people that are not mukallaf, who have not had the reaching of divine teaching. They're not aware of the book, they're not aware of the messenger, they're not aware of the message, but they may still hold on to a notion of nihilism. They would be disbelievers by definition, but they wouldn't be the same kind of disbeliever as, say, the Quraysh or those who study and reject the message. That there would be a distinction between these, and that distinction would be the quality of being mukallaf, which is to have met the conditions to be the responsible person or the legally responsible person. That is, you're an adult, you are capable of reasoning, so you're not suffering from sort of any mental deficiencies, you're sane, and you've had the reaching of divine teachings that have been unpolluted. So you've been given the message in its true form. You've not been lied. So, for example, if all you heard about Islam was what you were given from Tommy Robinson, and everyone around you is convincing you that Tommy Robinson knows his stuff. He's might as well be a sheikh because he studied it that much. This kind of nonsense. If that's all you've gotten your information from, and you're not even really familiar with what kind of person he is, so you're not really familiar with him being a bad person, but you're still young, and maybe inshallah, hopefully, in the future, that person will discover that this person is a horrible person, and that he spends a lot of his time lying, and you've seen the recent revelations as well with some of his ex-employees. He manipulates and lies with his recordings and mixes it up in editing to make it look like something happened that didn't happen. Once these kind of things become revealed to that person, that should motivate them to question the things that they've been saying about particular groups of people, for example, the Muslims, and then they should look into it. But you don't know at what point in their life that's going to happen, so you can't say anything about their destiny. You can't say whether or not they're going to end up in hell, because you don't know what sort of process they're going to go through. So that person is a distinct kind of person. We say they are a disbeliever, but they're not mukallaf because they've not had the reaching of divine teaching. And so you've got to keep that in mind. When it comes to referring to people as kuffars, there's different levels of kuffars or different kinds. It was about value at the start of lecture. At the start of this lecture, or all of the lectures. Let me have a look. Value. I don't know. So at the beginning of this lecture, I mentioned On Truth and Lying in a Non-Moral Sense by Friedrich Nietzsche, Edmund Husserl, The Idea of Phenomenology. the only other things I mentioned was my own work. So I did a dissertation, which you can find on my website at ponderingsoul.com, or if you search Yusuf Ponders Nihilism Dissertation, it should come up. And also the lecture that I posted on nihilism with, I'm just going to turn these lights. Yeah, so I did another essay on nihilism, distinct from my dissertation, taking a different path on the subject, which has been published on sapiensinstitute.org. But other than that, the will to power, Thomas Kuhn, the structure of scientific revolution. Those are the only things I mentioned at the beginning. I can't remember anything else with regards to that. And last question is Salam. Akhi, wa alaikum salam. So based on your answer about logic, doesn't logic then become subjective according to an atheist? So the problem here is you can't say that according to an atheist, because it depends on the atheist. Atheism, there could be an atheist proper, so that's a positive atheist who says he knows that God doesn't exist. That could be an agnostic, someone who's just, I don't know yet. And even agnostic atheists can break up into separate categories. So it could be strong agnostic in that he could posit that it's not possible to know whether or not God exists. He could be a soft agnostic in the sense that he says, or she says, you might be able to know, but I don't know. I've not achieved knowledge on that subject yet. It might very well be the case that I can achieve the knowledge if I was to look into it, but I haven't. So there's all these different layers. And simply hearing someone has said that they are an atheist isn't enough for you to say, well, this is what you think about logic. They don't know half of the time. It's, logic for the most part, it's just something a priori. It's embedded in the way we deal with the world. It's embedded in how we interact and approach. It's sort of innate in us. We deal with the world as though logic is a part of our structure. But it's not that it becomes necessarily subjective. Again, it depends on the person. There's a lot of nuance, and you'd have to speak to them as individuals and get to know what they know, or get to know what they believe. And then at that point, if they start getting to certain points where it's like, well, logic is meaningless, it's just, dependent on societies and on particular groups of peoples and blah, 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 blah. Then you can start saying, well, you've made logic here sound quite subjective. But there's not many people that are going to hold to that position. So yeah, that would be an answer to that. Then becomes subjective according to an atheist. So yeah, you can't make that claim. It's not according to the atheist position, because the atheist position is quite varied. It's quite chaotic. It's hard to pin down exactly. It's fluid. Because as long as it serves the purpose of everything is created by God and for a purpose, then something divine does logical. If not, it's illogical. Yeah, so just keep that in mind what I've said there. It can be for particular kinds of atheists. So the ones who hold onto this notion, for example, that materialist reductionism, everything can be reduced to the material world to just atoms bouncing off each other. Logic is just a human peculiarity in this case that developed with the evolution of the human being. And then if that's the case, it's like one group, like what is logic? It's a whole field of study. But we could go for hours. How long have we been going now? Yeah, I'm a bit over. But it's an interesting question. Just keep in mind there's a nuance to it, so don't just make these blanket statements with that. But yeah, Jazakallah khair. Jazakallah khair, Yusuf. Great lecture. May Allah reward you for sharing your insight. Yeah, thank you very much. Jazakallah khair to all of you who have attended. There's still 13 of you here. So barakallah feek to all of you who have managed to push on for nearly 3 hours. And sorry the Q&A went over a little bit. I just wanted to try and get to the bottom because I know I've not been able to do that for the other ones as well. But yeah, I hope that this is cogent, that you're understanding where we're going with this. We'll continue this next week. on Monday at 8 p.m. again, inshallah. So I look forward to doing that one, and I look forward to concluding this series with you. Be sure to give feedback as well. If you're enjoying it or not enjoying it, send emails to Sapience Institutes. If you go on there, there's a contact page, and so you can give them feedback on this lecture series, whether you found it beneficial or not. Either way, constructive feedback will be appreciated. So even if you didn't like it, don't hold back and don't be afraid to kind of give that feedback if you think it's necessary. Or just even giving ways you think that it may be improved, things you think I could have left out, things I maybe didn't explain too well, anything at all. Be that good or bad, please do give us your feedback. If you do it through the Sapience Institute email, obviously that will go through Hamza then, and he can get a good idea of how well I'm doing or how bad I'm doing. And that obviously will help sort of any progress with my relationship with them. Inshallah, though, I do hope you've enjoyed it. I do hope it has been beneficial, and that you are taking something away from this and that you are learning. But other than that, we shall leave that for today. Barakallahu feek. Assalamu alaikum rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.